Now, restrictions on travellers from China is unlikely to prevent new COVID variants from actually reaching the UK. That's according to the chairman of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Professor Andrew Pollard also said that it was very difficult to know whether any new variant that emerged in China would actually have a significant impact in Britain. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is reportedly considering the return of COVID travel restrictions for the first time since February. Several countries, including the US, Japan, Italy and Malaysia, are now enforcing testing on visitors from China. So, should Britain follow suit and reintroduce what some would regard as draconian restrictions on travel? To debate this, I am now joined by NHS GP, easy for me to say, Dr. David Lloyd, and political commentator Francis Hoar. Thank you very much, both of you. Great to have you on the show. Francis, I will start with you. I'm concerned that this is a slippery slope at the moment and that we are rolling the wicket as a country for more draconian COVID laws. This is how it started last time, is it not?
Yes, it is. And also, what happened last time is that it was revealed after the first travel restrictions were introduced in 2020. And I was acting for somebody who judicially reviewed those regulations, that SAGE had never recommended travel restrictions. It had said consistently that there was no good evidence that they would do any good. And that was when, of course, we were at a stage in the pandemic where we had very serious levels of a serious type, strain of COVID-19, albeit not necessarily nearly as serious as the government represented it. Now we are at a stage where we have a vast majority of the country has natural immunity in addition to vaccines. And the reason why China has had problems is because it's locked down for so long and restricted travel for so long that it doesn't have that level of immunity.
Well, it's on that,
so there's no real point, Francis, to think that we are under any greater risk.
Exactly. Look, it's on that exact point that I'm going to just throw it over to Dr. David now, NHS GP. Some people will be looking at this now and saying, well, in China, I mean, they're masked up constantly, aren't they? They seem to be locked down. People were being welded into their own blocks of flats. They've got a vaccine. And yet still, here we are. They've got loads and loads and loads of cases. Restrictions don't work. Why should we be imposing any over here?
Golly, I mean, if you're expecting a debate between the two of us, it's going to be difficult. Because I must say, I think it is slightly premature to think about a lockdown. I think we need to be ready to impose travel restrictions. But we're in a very different place than we were 2 years ago. We've got a fantastic team of scientists who can analyze the variants of the COVID very quickly. We need more accurate data from China to be absolutely sure.
Well, you're never going to get that.
And then if we're getting it, and I know that is the problem. And so we've got a problem with China not being totally truthful about what variants they've got. They have a terrible vaccine that doesn't give them good protection. And as you say, lockdown means that there are an awful lot of non-immune people, whereas we've got the opposite. We've got lots of antibodies, lots of good vaccines, and lots of good doctors. But it is a problem. And do you know how many people were admitted with COVID into the NHS last week?
No.
Guess.
How many people were admitted with COVID or as a result of COVID, or are we splitting hairs here?
Admitted with acute COVID infections last week.
Admitted with acute COVID infection. With the whole NHS, a frame of reference. Look, I don't know. 10,000, I don't know if even that.
Yeah, there's 7,158 and 508 people died of COVID last week. So we've still got a problem with our own COVID, but I think we've got the tools to be able to deal with it without restrictions. But that could change. It could change tomorrow or next week or any week after that. And do remember, I'm just an ordinary GP. I'm not someone working very high up in the system.
Well, no, but you crucially do have some medical knowledge and therefore a direct relevance to this discussion. But Francis, I will throw it back your way for a second. I'm keen to get your take on one of the big arguments. Look, I can remember reading a headline about a Nepalese variant that we should all be terrified of that turned out to never exist, right? And I am now naturally very sceptical about this idea of, well, we wouldn't want a new, more dangerous variant to come into the UK. Let's just fast forward, Francis. Let's say there is a new, more dangerous variant, and it is more deadly, and it is more transmissible. Do you still not call for any COVID restrictions? Do you say we've got a vaccine, we've seen the economic impact of this, the impact on children's health and well-being and education, all of that stuff, let it rip?
Well, I think there are two issues here. One is that we have never before had any sort of virus that we are able to track and determine different types of variants. And we have that because of the enormous amounts of resources that were pushed into determining those sorts of variants, which led to a very, very heavy tracking of each of the types of variants while we had travel restrictions. I don't think that's necessarily a sensible use of our resources. I think it makes for bad policy making. I think it means that you have too much knowledge in one very specific area of one very specific virus. We have all sorts of different viruses. At the moment, we have, as Dr. Lloyd will know, serious types of flu, which we have many in many winters and will continue to have. And the reason it makes for bad policy making is because it creates this kind of need, the response that there is a knee-jerk reaction to impose travel restrictions whenever there might be a new or different type of variant. I don't think it's good to give government that much data and the press and the public that much cause for concern, frankly. I mean,
I'm inclined to agree with you, and you've led me nicely on to the next question for Dr. David, because Dr. David, when we look at things in the round now, one of the benefits of having had the initial blast of coronavirus a couple of years ago was that we lived through it, and that we know now some of the knock-on effects of the reactions to it that we had, right? And some of those effects are, massive cancer waiting lists and poor NHS treatment as a result, and all of these knock-on effects, right? Knowing what we know now, if something similar happened again, which might be about to, given what we're seeing in China at the minute, would you still recommend something like a lockdown, knowing all of the consequences, all of the side effects?
Well, don't forget, every infection is different. Every infection has different chances of infectivity. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember getting into spacesuits to swab people with swine flu, and that turned out to be absolutely nothing. But we did genuinely feel that flu had a higher mortality rate than ordinary flu. And so there were an awful lot of very worried people. You really can't make decisions and say that's what we're going to stick to in these circumstances. You've got to have a little bit of flexibility. And I think the government does need to have the ability to make legislation to lock down if necessary, or to restrict people from travel. But we know more now about COVID. And I think what we also know is just how terribly prepared we were. The USA was rated number 1 for pandemic preparedness before COVID. And look what's happened. They've killed 1 million people. And, and that showed just how dreadful they were prepared. We've got to prepare for the next pandemic, and we've got to be flexible.
I get all of that. I think there will be a lot of people out there right now looking at their bank balance, looking at the sacrifices that they personally made, looking at the fact that their elderly grandmother or grandfather who had dementia in a care home and they couldn't see them, they might have died now, lost precious memories. Their child is late to walk and talk as a result of no mixing. They're now sending their kid to school and they're getting ill every single week because children didn't mix. And we look at this bigger picture, and I think it's going to take one hell of a COVID kickoff to get people to do anything again that Chris Whitty and co might want us. But Francis, can I ask a question that might seem a little bit woo, right? But I'm going to ask it anyway, because if I'm looking at the numbers in China, and if I'm starting to look at even a conversation now around, well, maybe we should lock down, maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that, I'm starting to wonder, is there something a bit more sinister going on, in your view, from our political class? Do they want us all locked down?
No, I genuinely don't think that, certainly not now. I do want to come back on this point about preparation, though, because what we did prepare for and what we did know about in a number of pandemic plans leading up to in our country, which were updated frequently, and also the WHO updated most recently before the pandemic in October 2019, is how little evidence there was of any efficacy for any of the measures that were foreseen then, which did not include lockdown. Incidentally, which did include things like isolation of contacts of those people who had been infected, closures of schools and closures of businesses. We knew that the harms would outweigh the benefits because we'd done that preparation, we'd done that work. And we also knew far more about the virus by March 2020 than many let on. We had the Diamond Princess, which allowed us to evaluate the way in which that virus affected different age groups and different categories of people. So it's not right to say that we were unprepared in the sense of knowing that this was a very bad idea.
All right, fair enough. Look,
We
both
were
of you.
very-
Oh, go on, Dr. David. I'll just give you the final word on it. Go on, what are you saying?
I think in March 2020, we were extremely unprepared. We didn't have the resources, we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the beginnings of anything to prevent it. I was working in a COVID hub, I was running a COVID hub in my local area, and I promise you, it was one of the most frightening things I've ever lived through.
Dr. David, just
we
quickly...
needed to have lockdown at that stage.
Just quickly, yeah. Well, would you have... Going back in time, would you do things differently in terms of the lockdowns, i.e., would you not deliberately commit economic suicide in the way that we did?
I honestly, you in hindsight, I shall await the results of the investigations with interest. But honestly, it was a very, very dark time, and lockdown was absolutely the most obvious thing to do at the time.
Okay, it's okay, guys. Sorry, this is. You got to love the news. I'm just having something in my ear right now. Genuinely, Stephen Swinford in the Times has just reported that it's likely that the government is going to introduce mandatory COVID tests for people arriving from China. That is just dropping right now. Dr. David and then Francis. Dr. David, your view? Good thing, bad thing?
I think that's absolutely proportionate and the right thing to do. It's not restricting travel. We'll get an idea about the variants that are coming from China in our own labs, and then we'll be able to respond accordingly.
This is a fascinating development, actually, if true, which Stephen Swinford, to be fair, is normally quite accurate, very accurate, really, with what he says. Francis, the concern for me, then, will be what do we do with them? So they test positive. I mean, we've already got a load of hotels full. I won't make a reference to what's going on in the channel, although I am. Our hotels are already full. Where do we put these people? We can't quarantine them, can we? Do we just send them back to China?
Well, I understood Dr. Lloyd to say at the beginning of this, before he knew this news, that it wouldn't be proportionate or advisable to issue these sort of impose these sort of restrictions now. I don't think it's proportionate, and I don't think it's necessary. We have very small numbers of travellers to China. We have vast amounts of COVID, numerous different variants, because we've had 3 years of evolution of this virus. It's now an endemic virus for us. We have to live with it. We have to live with all sorts of viruses. And going back to this point about lockdown, the reality is that if you look at 2000, 99, 2000, the death rate in that period of the peak virus in 99, 2000, which we barely talk about, looks very, very similar indeed to what happened in this lockdown. We don't talk about it because we didn't have the kind of economic, cultural and social catastrophe that was caused by lockdown. We did have a lot of death, but that is what happens with viruses. They come in, people get them, and we build up immunity and they go away.
I think this is just... I am concerned. Yeah, I am concerned. And again, it's important to emphasise for everyone watching and listening, this has literally just come through live on air, and it actually hasn't happened yet. It's likely to happen, supposedly anyway, that the government will introduce mandatory tests for people arriving from China, COVID tests. I hope that I'm not sitting here in a couple of months' time and thinking this was what paved the way for them to start testing everybody from every single country again, and then it all hyped up again. I just have terrible deja vu about all this. Look, both of you, thank you very, very...
Let's get on top of it now. Let's test those very few people coming from China, identify genomically what the variants are, and see whether we've got antibodies to them. I think that's an entirely sensible thing to do. I'm not proposing locking down or getting draconian, as you right-wingers would quite like to do. I would like this to be proportionate and that we stay on top of the virus. The thing about COVID is that we've got new tools now. We can monitor illness much more effectively.
Yes, to be fair, it was, and just a minor point of correction there, Dr. David, it was supposedly the most left-wing countries in the world, New Zealand and Canada, who had the most draconian restrictions, so let's have it right. Anyway, enough of that. NHS GP, Dr. David Lloyd, and political commentator Francis Hoar, just reacting, actually, as it turned out, to the latest information that's just dropped to us, which is that supposedly, anyway, this government is very likely to introduce mandatory testing for arrivals from China. Good idea, bad idea, your views, GBViews at GBNews.uk. I can very much see both sides to that argument, actually. Anyway,